Okay, everybody. So let's jump into um, a little lesson on J.P. Morgan. So this lesson is going to be kind of a template for how you guys should be doing your entrepreneur projects, as well as looking at the life and business and legacy of J.P. Morgan. So let's start with this. Here's a picture of J.P. Morgan, John Pierpont Morgan. He preferred to be called J.P. or Morgan or Pierpont. He didn't like John. I'm just going to leave it at that. So here's some quotes from J.P. Morgan. And remember, you need a quote about from your entrepreneur that reflects some of what it was that he stood for or believed. So the first one, a man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom. I think that is the fundamental basis of business. Lesson number one here. Morgan was willing to deal with people who he trusted more than people who were just wealthy. He was more concerned that you as a person could be trusted with the business agreements you made than if you were simply rich enough to pay them back. Probably some bad experience he had with people of wealth. Number two, I feel bound in honor when I reorganize a property and am morally responsible for its management to protect it. And I generally do protect it. Morgan made a great deal of his money on taking failed businesses and fixing them, reorganizing them. He looked at this as not only a business venture, but as an actual moral obligation. It made him money, yes. It made money for the company, for all the stockholders and shareholders. It also benefited the employees and the American public as well, who were buying products that that company was creating or selling. And the last one, gold is money, everything else is credit. Well, somebody's a big fan of the gold standard. So let's talk about JP. And we're going to start today's lesson with some background information on the old Pierpont. So let's look at the Morgan family itself. The Morgans, as a family, had come to America in 1636. They were English. Now, one of the things, there's a couple of big differences between J.P. Morgan and the other millionaires that we're looking at. So, difference number one, Morgan's family was wealthy. They had come from England in the 1630s, where the Morgans had been very successful farmers and soldiers. They were firmly and strongly middle class individuals. When the Morgans arrived in America, they had enough money to buy big chunks of the colony of Massachusetts, where they began farming, and eventually they were very strong patriots and revolutionaries during the War for Independence. In 1812, Joseph Morgan III, he's got to be important because he's got Roman numerals after his name. Joe Morgan III, who is JP's granddaddy, decided to open up a bank. Now, it's not like banks are today where you kind of have to be like a business and get permission to open a bank. Back in those days, if you just had cash enough and you wanted to loan it out, you could legally become a bank. And that's what he did. But in the brilliance of Joe Morgan, he didn't just like open a bank, he opened up a coffee shop that was a bank. He bought an existing coffee shop. He continued to run the coffee shop. He also ran his bank out of it. So when people would come in for their, whatever the equivalent of their, grande latte with soy milk and, you know, guava juice, um, Morgan would not only serve them coffee, but he would be there to act as a legal representative, to witness for them, and to loan them money if their businesses needed it. It became a hotspot for businessmen, and it's where people went in Hartford, Connecticut to arrange business agreements, to get loans, and to do everyday savings banking. Morgan made enough money from his coffee shop and bank to buy an insurance company, and he started his own insurance company with that. It's called Aetna. Aetna is still around today. They're a high-end specialty insurance company. At one point in time, Morgan's insurance company, Aetna, was the insurance provider for most of the businesses in New York City. There was a big fire in downtown New York in like the late 1820s, early 1830s. Morgan was the insurance provider for most of New York. When the fire happened, obviously, all these people who lost stuff, they wanted their money and they were clients of Joe Morgan. Morgan did not have enough money to cover all of his insurance contracts. So what he did was he essentially put himself into bankruptcy. He sold personal possessions, he liquidated his own assets, and he paid off every single insurance claim as quickly as he could. He was completely broke, had no money left. Within 2 years, Morgan had doubled the money he lost because all of those companies that he paid those claims on came back to him because they knew that they could count on Joe Morgan to cover them. And other companies who needed insurance came to him as well because they knew they could count on him to cover their insurance needs and costs. So Morgan really made out well. He made out so well, in fact, that Joe bought a hotel and opened up the main and bought the main bank of Hartford, and he sat back for the rest of his life and just made money. That's not a bad life if you can get it. Joe's son Junius entered the family business in 1829 at the age of 15. At the age of 20, Junius went out and became apprenticed to lawyers and bankers across the country, where he learned law and banking as well as insurance. And in 1864, Junius set up his own company, J.S. Morgan and Company. One of the things to understand here, and this is a big point to make about JP, Joe Morgan was very wealthy. He was a millionaire. Junius did not simply rest on dad's money, though. By apprenticing to other companies, he learned on his own and he got his own start and he opened up his own business. J.S. Morgan and Company became one of the major banks in Europe and the United States. So that's a little bit of background of JP's family. Now, JP himself, J. Pierpont Morgan, born in 1837 in Connecticut. As a child, Morgan attended public school in Connecticut. Now, it's important to understand here that 200 years ago, public education in America, it was very, very different than what it is today. First and foremost, public schools were actually all run by religious organizations, by churches. That's a weird concept for us now, but there's a very long story to public education in America that we're not going to go into. But just boil it down that the government just gave money to different church groups and they ran the schools to teach kids basic educational stuff. When he hit about middle school age, he, Pierpont was transferred, JP was transferred to a private college prep school, not unlike BA. Um, Unlike the other millionaires we talked about too, not only was JP from a wealthy family to begin with, and he grew up with wealth, he actually went to college. And if you're going to go to college, might as well go all out. He attended college in Europe, specifically in the German states and in Switzerland. He was a double major, math, well, go figure, finance, economics, and money, and art history, which is kind of a quirky double major, but he really, really liked art. And as we'll see later, his kind of double major benefited him. While in Europe, he became fluent in, he already spoke English, obviously, but he became fluent in French and German as well. Now, why is this important? Almost all the major banks in Europe were headquartered in either England or somewhere in the United Kingdom or Switzerland or one of these small German states, which meant that they all spoke French, German, or English, or all three of them. Morgan learned those languages to be able to do business and to be able to bank in those countries and to be banking around the world. After college, he returned to America and he began working for Dad. Now, Morgan's private money, his own personal fortune, began when he was in his mid 20s. In 1859, 1860, the US government decided that it was going to upgrade the entire Army's rifles. And so they wouldn't need the old rifles. They sold off all the old rifles super cheap. Morgan bought many of them. Give me a second. Sorry, slight pause. Had to sneeze. Hit the sneeze button. Morgan bought up all those old rifles. In some cases, like he paid literally like 10 cents on the dollar. So if a rifle would normally have cost the government $10, Morgan bought it for a buck or $2. When the Civil War breaks out a year and a half later, the Army's got no guns. What do? Morgan steps in and says, "Hey, I got all these guns. How about you buy them?" The the Army did. The U.S. Army bought back the guns they had sold Morgan, except that they paid way, way, way more than what he had bought them for. He made a $125,000 profit selling guns back to the Union Army at the start of the war. When the war was over, Morgan used his money to go into business with a man named Anton Drexel, and they formed their own business corporation, Drexel Morgan and Company. Drexel had died in 1895, and Morgan took over the business completely by himself, creating J.P. Morgan and Company. Morgan specialized in business consolidation and business reorganization. Consolidation was where he would take multiple businesses in the same industry and combine them together. Reorganization is where he would take a business that was failing or not doing too well and fix it to make it work better. Okay, so this is where we'll leave off. Tomorrow we'll talk about some specifics and look at the companies that he ran and stuff. Otherwise, thanks a lot. Peace.